What would you do if the family you married into handed you a single dollar and called it your inheritance? For that $1, a sum so small it was almost an insult in itself, a young widow was given the deed to a forgotten storage unit on the edge of town, a metal box no one had opened in nearly 20 years. They smiled as they signed it over to her, certain it held nothing but junk and dust, certain she would sell what little she found for scrap and disappear from their lives for good. But sealed inside a single wooden crate at the back of that unit was a secret worth more than every dollar the family had ever counted. Settle in, and let us travel back to the late summer of 1979, to a quiet crossroads town in the Georgia Low Country, and the remarkable story of Nora Calloway and the crate at Larkspur Self-Storage. Nora Calloway stepped off the Trailways bus into the wet heat of a Larkspur afternoon carrying one suitcase, a manila envelope of paperwork, and a leash attached to Scout, an old blue-tick hound with cloudy eyes and a limp in his back left leg. She was 26 years old, 3 months a widow, and she had exactly $41 to her name. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel smoke, and Nora stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the Gulf station, feeling the town settle its gaze on her the way small towns do. Slow and thorough and impossible to escape. A woman sweeping the porch of the diner across the street paused mid-stroke to watch. 2 men leaning against a pickup truck stopped talking. Scout pressed his graying muzzle into her palm, the only familiar thing left in the world. Her husband, James Calloway, had been dead 3 months. A blood clot, sudden and cruel, had taken him in his sleep on a Tuesday in June, and Nora had spent the weeks since learning that grief has its own gravity, pulling everything else out of orbit. She had also spent those weeks learning what the Calloway family truly thought of her. The reading of James's father's estate had taken place 2 weeks earlier in a lawyer's office in Savannah. All dark wood paneling and ceiling fans that did nothing against the heat. Richard Calloway, James's older brother, had worn a suit a size too tight and a smile a size too wide as he laid out the terms with the lawyer's quiet assistance. The house on Magnolia Street, the Calloway hardware business, the truck, the savings, all of it went to Richard and his mother Vivian, exactly as old Walter Calloway had apparently intended before his death the previous spring. And for James's widow, the lawyer had cleared his throat and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "There's also this," Richard had said, unable to keep the smirk from tugging at his mouth. "Granddaddy's old storage unit out past the rail yard. Nobody's touched it in years. Full of his junk, probably. We figured. Well, it ought to go to somebody in the family who might have the patience to sort through it." For the sum of $1, the lawyer had added, almost apologetically, as required to make the transfer legal. Vivian Calloway had said nothing at all, only studied her manicure with the particular stillness of a woman enjoying herself. Nora had signed the paper without a word, feeling the eyes of the room on her, refusing to let her hand shake. $1. The price of a cup of coffee. The price of her place in a family that had never wanted her. Now, standing in the heat outside the Gulf station with her suitcase and her dog, that distant humiliation became something she would have to live inside. She asked the attendant for directions to Larkspur Self-Storage, and he pointed her down a 2-lane road that ran alongside the railroad tracks, past a tractor dealership and a shuttered drive and movie screen leaning against the sky like a tombstone. The walk took the better part of an hour under a sun that pressed down like a hand. Scout trotted beside her, favoring his bad leg, stopping now and then to sniff at the kudzu that swallowed the fence line. When the storage yard finally came into view, Nora's steps slowed. It was not what she had pictured. Rows of corrugated metal units stretched back from the road in uneven lines, their doors a faded, sun-bleached orange. rust blooming along the seams like a disease. Weeds grew waist-high between some of the rows. A single office sat near the entrance, more shed than building, with a hand-lettered sign that read "Office Ring Bell for Service," the paint peeling at the edges. It looked less like a place to store treasure than a place things went to be forgotten entirely. She found Unit 114 at the very back row, half in shadow from an overgrown pecan tree. The padlock had rusted into a solid orange lump. The metal door was dented low on one side, as though something heavy had struck it long ago and no one had ever bothered to fix it. Nora stood before it for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what she'd been given, or rather, what she'd been discarded to. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them think this is nothing. I have nowhere else to be. She would not give the Callaways the satisfaction of watching her fail. Not yet.
The journey to Thornfield took the better part of 2 days, and Isabel spent much of it composing and abandoning, in equal measure, the various speeches she imagined herself delivering to whichever member of the family finally received her. She arrived, in the end, saying almost nothing at all, ushered not to the great house itself, but directly to the small, weathered gatehouse at the estate's furthest boundary, where an elderly steward named Mr. Price awaited her with an expression that suggested he found the entire arrangement as puzzling as she did. "His Grace sends his regrets that he could not receive you personally," Price said, though his tone carried little conviction that any genuine regret existed on the Duke's part. "He asks only that you keep the gatehouse in reasonable order and that you make no particular effort to trouble the household at the main house regarding matters that do not concern you." "And the bridge?" Isabel asked, glancing toward the collapsed stone structure visible beyond the gatehouse's small garden, its central span fallen entirely into the river below. Weeds and moss claiming what remained of its ancient arches. "Fallen these past 6 years, miss. Cost more to repair than His Grace has ever judged it worth, given how few travellers this road sees now that the main crossing further south serves most purposes well enough. I shouldn't trouble yourself over it, if I were you. No one else has." Isabel studied the ruined bridge for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that surprised her, precisely why it had been chosen for her exile. It was not merely distant from the house, it was a symbol, whether the Duke had intended it consciously or not, of exactly the kind of quiet, permanent neglect he wished to extend toward her. Visible enough that no one could claim she had been entirely abandoned, but broken and forgotten enough that no one would ever expect anything worthwhile to come of the arrangement. She did not yet know that the bridge's collapse held secrets considerably more complicated than simple neglect, or that untangling those secrets would eventually lead her back to the very accusation that had exiled her from Thornfield 8 years before. She met the Duke himself only 3 days after her arrival, and not, as she had half expected, by any deliberate summons on his part. She encountered him instead at the boundary between the gatehouse grounds and the wider estate, where she had gone walking in the late afternoon light, still unsettled by the strange, hollow quiet of a house she had once, briefly, called home. He did not recognize her at first. 8 years and considerable change had passed since she had last stood before him. Herself scarcely more than a girl at the time, and his own memory of that distant cousin's disgrace had clearly grown vague with disuse. It was only when she gave her name, watching his expression shift from polite confusion to something considerably more guarded, that he understood precisely whom he addressed. "Miss Merrow," he said finally, "I had not expected to encounter you so directly. Your solicitor's letter did not specify that I should avoid the grounds entirely, Your Grace, merely that I should not trouble the household. I confess I did not realize a simple walk constituted trouble." Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, though close enough to it that Isabel found herself, despite everything, briefly unsettled by the resemblance to warmth. "No," he admitted. "I suppose it doesn't." He did not linger in conversation, offering only a brief, formal inquiry into whether the gatehouse suited her needs before continuing on whatever business had originally brought him to that corner of the estate. But Isabel noticed, watching him go, that his gaze had drifted more than once during their brief exchange toward the collapsed bridge beyond the gatehouse garden, a look that carried something considerably more complicated than the simple indifference Mr. Price's account had suggested. She did not yet understand what that look meant, or why a bridge the Duke claimed not worth the cost of repair should draw his attention with such evident, unwilling weight. That understanding would come only gradually, over the weeks that followed, as she began, almost despite herself, to take a genuine interest in the ruin she had been sent to quietly ignore. Isabel's first weeks at the gatehouse passed in the particular quiet rhythm of a woman rebuilding, once again, a life reduced to its barest essentials. She kept the small cottage in careful order, tended the modest garden Price's predecessor had apparently once maintained with more enthusiasm than the current steward troubled himself with, and found, in the solitude of that remote corner of the estate, a peace she had not expected to feel so soon after her return to a place that had once caused her such profound humiliation. It was the bridge itself, in the end, that drew her attention most persistently, not out of any particular ambition, at first, but simply because it stood so constantly within view of the gatehouse's small windows. A daily reminder of ruin that gradually, over those first quiet weeks, began to feel less like an accident of geography and more like a puzzle she had not yet fully understood. She began walking its length in the early mornings, when mist still clung to the river below, studying the pattern of its collapse with the careful attention she had once applied, as a girl, to her father's rare stories of the estate's history. The central span had fallen cleanly, she noted, in a manner that struck her the more closely she examined it, as somewhat peculiar for a structure claimed to have simply succumbed to age and neglect. The stonework at the break showed signs, faint but unmistakable to a careful eye, of deliberate weakening rather than gradual decay, chisel marks along certain load-bearing points that no natural erosion could easily explain. She mentioned this observation to no one at first, uncertain whether her own suspicion reflected genuine discovery or simply the restless imagination of a woman with too much solitary time and too many old grievances still unresolved. But the observation lodged itself in her mind regardless, refusing to be dismissed, and she found herself returning to the bridge again and again over the following weeks, gathering small details that gradually, piece by piece, began to suggest a history considerably more deliberate than simple accident. If Isabel's story is pulling you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, this is only the beginning of what's hidden beneath that collapsed bridge. Make sure you're subscribed, because what she uncovers next connects directly back to the very accusation that exiled her from Thornfield 8 years ago. And I still want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love watching this map fill up, with all of you listening from around the world. The first true clue arrived not from the bridge itself, but from an elderly woman named Mrs. Tillett, who kept a small cottage near the ruined crossing, and who had lived, by her own account, within sight of that bridge for the better part of 60 years. Fell strange, that bridge did, Mrs. Tillett said one afternoon, when Isabel had stopped to exchange the particular quiet courtesies neighbours extend in remote corners of large estates. I remember the night well enough, though I was younger then and thought little of it beyond the noise. Autumn storm, they said, weakened the old stonework, past bearing, that I recall, clear as anything, seeing lantern light along the bridge itself the evening before its collapse, men working at something in the dark, though I couldn't rightly say what, and no one ever spoke of repairs being carried out that night, before or since. Do you remember who the men were, Mrs. Tillett? The old woman considered the question with the particular slowness of memory reaching far back into years grown thin. Estate men, I always assumed, though I couldn't swear to faces at that distance an hour. There was talk, for a time, that the old Duke himself the current one's father, that would be, had ordered the bridge weakened deliberately. Though I never understood why anyone would trouble themselves to ruin a perfectly serviceable crossing. The talk died down soon enough, the way such things do, and I confess I'd nearly forgotten it myself until you asked. Isabel thanked Mrs. Tillett and continued her walk with her mind considerably more unsettled than before. A bridge deliberately weakened, on the very estate where she had once been falsely accused of theft, in the years surrounding what she now understood, with growing unease, might not have been entirely separate incidents after all. She did not yet see the full shape of the connection. But she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from patient, careful observation, that Thornfield's quiet corners held considerably more secrets than the great house's polished public rooms had ever troubled themselves to reveal. It was in the gatehouse itself, some weeks later, that Isabel found the discovery that finally began to connect the bridge's suspicious collapse to her own long-buried disgrace. She had been clearing a small, disused storage room at the cottage's rear, unused, by all appearances, for years beyond counting, when she discovered, tucked behind a loose panel in the room's old wooden wall, a small collection of papers that had clearly been hidden there deliberately and left undisturbed since. They belonged, she understood almost immediately from the careful, familiar handwriting, to the gatehouse's previous occupant, a woman named Sarah Loft, who had served, Isabel gathered from the papers themselves, as companion to the old Duchess during the very years surrounding Isabel's own disgrace and exile. The papers were not a formal journal, but a series of private notes, seemingly written for no audience beyond the author's own troubled conscience. They described, in increasingly anxious detail, a growing suspicion that the old Duchess's missing brooch, the very item whose disappearance had condemned Isabel 8 years before, had never truly been stolen at all, but had instead been deliberately planted among Isabel's belongings by someone within the household determined to see the young girl removed from Thornfield entirely. I do not know who bears the true blame, one entry read, in handwriting grown visibly unsteady with the weight of what it described, though I have my suspicions I dare not commit fully to paper, even here, where I trust no eyes but my own will ever fall upon these words. The girl wept most piteously, protesting her innocence with a conviction I confess troubled me greatly at the time, though I said nothing, coward that I was, fearing what speaking against the old Duchess's certainty might cost my own modest position in this household. Isabel read that entry 3 times before she trusted herself to fully understand its weight. She had not imagined her own innocence, all those years of quiet, private certainty against a household's collective condemnation. Someone at Thornfield had deliberately engineered her disgrace, for reasons the old companion's guilty notes did not yet fully explain. She did not yet understand what connection, if any, existed between her own false accusation and the bridge's suspicious collapse, both occurring within the same troubled years of Thornfield's history. That connection, she suspected, lay buried somewhere deeper still in the estate's guarded past. The connection revealed itself gradually, over the following weeks, through a combination of careful observation and the reluctant, piecemeal cooperation of servants who had, Isabel came to understand, spent years maintaining a careful silence about matters they privately found deeply troubling. It was Mr. Price himself, growing gradually more sympathetic to Isabel's quiet, persistent questions, who finally offered the piece that connected every earlier thread. He confided, one grey afternoon, as they walked the boundary near the ruined bridge, that the current Duke's own father had harboured, in his final years, a growing and increasingly desperate fear that Isabel's own father, his younger brother, had left behind, before his early death. Documentation proving an inheritance claim considerably stronger than the family had ever publicly acknowledged. There was talk, among the older servants when I first came to this position, that your father held papers proving Thornfield's succession ought properly to have passed differently than it did. Some old entailment matter. Complicated enough that I confess I never fully understood the particulars myself. The old Duke feared, I believe, that such papers might one day surface and unsettle his own son's inheritance. And the bridge? Price's expression grew carefully guarded. The bridge crossed toward the old parish records office, Miss, in the village 3 miles distant, where such entailment papers would have been formally recorded and preserved. I cannot say with certainty that its collapse was connected to your father's claim, but I confess the timing has always struck me as considerably more convenient than simple accident usually allows. Isabel understood, in that moment, the full shape of what had happened to her 8 years before. She had not been exiled from Thornfield merely out of simple family coldness or dislike. She had been deliberately, calculatedly removed, her reputation destroyed through a planted accusation, precisely because her continued presence at Thornfield and her father's buried claim threatened an inheritance the old Duke had determined, by whatever means necessary, to protect for his own son. The bridge's collapse, she now understood, had likely served the same desperate purpose, severing, however temporarily, the most direct route to records that might have proven her father's claim, buying the old Duke time to ensure whatever documentation existed was quietly, permanently suppressed before anyone thought to seek it out. Before we see what Isabel does with this discovery, I need to ask you again, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the reason this story exists at all. And for those of you who've already told me where you're watching from, thank you. For anyone who hasn't yet, the comments are still open, and I truly do read every single one. Isabel brought her discoveries to the current Duke with considerably more caution than her earlier certainty might have suggested, understanding that whatever role his own father had played in her disgrace, the current Duke himself had inherited a position built, at least in part, upon a foundation of deliberate deception he might not have personally constructed, but had certainly, comfortably, benefited from ever since. She laid before him, in the same small study where he had once offered her only the barest formal courtesy, Sarah Loft's guilty private notes, Mrs. Tillet's account of lantern light along the bridge the night before its collapse, and Mr. Price's careful, reluctant testimony regarding her father's suppressed inheritance claim. He read through each piece in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled, until finally he set the papers down and looked at her with something that might, in a less guarded man, have been genuine distress. "My own father," he said quietly, "engineered your disgrace and quite possibly destroyed a bridge, to protect an inheritance that may never have rightfully belonged to either of us at all. I cannot yet prove the full extent of it, Your Grace, but the pattern is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence, however much I suspect you might wish to." He did not argue the point, though Isabel watched him wrestle, visibly, with the full weight of what her discoveries implied. Not merely a private family cruelty, but a question that might, if properly proven, unsettle the very inheritance he had spent his entire adult life assuming was rightfully, uncomplicatedly his own. "What do you intend to do with this?" he asked finally. "I intend, Your Grace, to see the truth properly established, whatever it ultimately proves. I do not seek to unseat you from a title I have no particular ambition to claim for myself. I seek only what should have been extended to me 8 years ago, and was instead deliberately, cruelly withheld, an honest accounting of what actually happened, rather than the convenient lie your family has maintained ever since." The search for her father's original documentation consumed the better part of the following month, conducted with a thoroughness that surprised even Isabel herself, who had not expected the Duke's own resources to be extended so readily toward uncovering a truth that might yet complicate his own position considerably. They found, eventually, in the parish records office the bridge's collapse had once made so difficult to reach, exactly what Price's careful account had suggested: formal documentation. Decades old, but still legally valid, establishing that Isabel's father had indeed held a claim to Thornfield's succession that the family's later arrangements had quietly, deliberately overlooked. The claim, once properly examined by solicitors the Duke himself engaged for the purpose, proved considerably more limited in its practical effect than the old Duke's evident panic might have suggested. A matter, in the end, more easily resolved through formal acknowledgement and modest financial settlement than any true unseating of the current Duke's position. But the acknowledgement itself mattered enormously to Isabel, in ways she had not fully anticipated until the solicitor's formal letter finally arrived, confirming in careful legal language what she had known, privately and without proof, for the better part of 8 years, that she had been wronged, deliberately and calculatedly, by a family determined to protect its own comfortable fiction at whatever cost her own reputation required. What followed the truth's full establishment was not a dramatic public reckoning, but something slower and, in its own quiet way, considerably more meaningful. The Duke saw to it that Isabel's name was formally, properly cleared among the county's solicitors and record-keepers. The old theft accusation officially struck from whatever informal record had followed her these 8 years. He offered, too, a settlement considerably beyond what the modest legal claim alone required, in acknowledgement of what his own father's deception had cost her. Isabel accepted only what fairness genuinely demanded, declining the more generous portions of his offer with a quiet firmness that seemed, if anything, to increase rather than diminish the Duke's evident respect for her. What she asked for instead, when he pressed her to name some further recompense, was considerably simpler and considerably more meaningful to the life she had begun. Almost without noticing, to build for herself at Thornfield's quiet eastern boundary. She asked that the bridge be properly restored. The restoration began that same autumn, funded generously from the estate's own resources and directed, at Isabel's insistence, according to plans that would ensure the crossing served the surrounding villages properly for generations to come, rather than simply patching over whatever damage the original sabotage had caused. She worked alongside the estate's masons and engineers with a genuine growing interest in the project's progress, understanding, as the new stonework gradually rose to replace what deliberate cruelty had once destroyed, that she was rebuilding considerably more than a simple river crossing. Mrs. Tillett, who had first offered the crucial memory of lantern light along the doomed bridge, lived nearby enough to watch the restoration's progress from her own cottage window, and she took evident, quiet satisfaction in seeing the crossing finally repaired after so many years of neglect. "I always thought it a shame," she told Isabel, watching the new central span slowly take shape above the river, seeing good stonework left to ruin over whatever old grievance caused it. "Glad I am to see it mended, whatever the true story behind its falling." By the time winter's first frost arrived, the bridge stood whole again for the first time in 6 years, solid, properly engineered, considerably sturdier than the original structure, whatever deliberate weakness had once compromised it. Isabel stood at its centre on the morning of its formal reopening, watching the first travellers in years cross the River Thorn without the long, difficult detour the ford had required, and felt something settle within her that she had not expected to feel so completely. Not merely vindication, though vindication mattered considerably, but the particular satisfaction of having built something genuinely useful from ground everyone else had long since abandoned as hopeless.
Word of the strange discovery in Unit 114 spread through Larkspur, with the particular speed small towns reserve for anything unexpected. Dale, true to his word, had mentioned the guitars to a fellow musician passing through Atlanta, who mentioned it to another, until eventually the story reached a man named Harlan Weiss, an instrument appraiser and collector who traveled through the South each fall buying and evaluating vintage stringed instruments for a shop in Nashville. He arrived at the storage yard on a bright October afternoon in a car far nicer than anything Larkspur was used to seeing, and Nora led him back to Unit 114, now swept clean and organized. The 6 guitars laid out on a table she'd built from salvaged wood. Harlan went quiet the moment he saw them. He picked up the first guitar with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred, turning it in the light, examining the joinery, the inlay, the small maker's mark burned into the inside of the sound hole. E.C. 1961, Mrs. Calloway, he said finally, his voice unsteady. Do you have any idea what you're sitting on? There were a handful of self-taught luthiers working in the rural South at mid-century, whose instruments have become nearly legendary among collectors, precisely because so few survive and so little is known about them. If these test out the way I believe they will, you are looking at one of the most significant private collections of American hand-built instruments to surface in decades. Museums will want these. Collectors will fight over these. This isn't worth $1, Mrs. Calloway. He looked up at her, still holding the guitar as though it might vanish. This is worth more than the entire Calloway estate combined. Richard Calloway arrived a week later, having heard the news secondhand through half the county before it reached him directly. He stood in the doorway of Unit 114, taking in the neat rows of instruments, the appraiser's paperwork spread across the table, the quiet, steady way Nora moved through what had once been a room full of junk. He said nothing for a long moment. Whatever he had come intending to say seemed to die somewhere behind his teeth. He looked at his grandfather's guitars, at the woman he had once mocked over a grocery store counter, now spoken of with something bordering on awe by half the town, and finally, without a word, he turned and walked back to his car. A year passed, and Larkspur watched Unit 114 transform from a punchline into something closer to a local landmark. With the funds from the sale of 2 of the less rare instruments to a museum collection in Nashville, Nora was able to lease a small storefront on Elm Street, not far from the seamstress who had once slipped biscuits into her grocery bag. She restored it slowly, sanding the old floors herself, building shelves along the walls, and opened it not as a shop, but as a small workshop and gallery, a place where Emmett Calloway's remaining instruments could be seen, and where Nora herself, guided by a stack of Emmett's old notebooks and no small amount of stubborn patience, had begun to teach herself the beginnings of his craft. Larkspur no longer whispered about the widow from the storage yard. They spoke, when they spoke of her at all, of Nora Calloway, keeper of Emmett's guitars. On a cool evening the following spring, Otis Renfro stopped by the workshop as he did most weeks now, letting himself in the back door with the easy familiarity of an old friend. He found Nora at the workbench, sanding the curved body of a mandolin she was building from a pattern in Emmett's notes. Scout dozing in a patch of late sunlight by her feet. They handed you $1's worth of junk, Otis said, settling into the chair across from her, shaking his head with a small smile. And you built all this. Nora set down her sanding block and looked around the small, warm room, the instruments hanging in careful rows along the walls, the light catching the grain of the wood the way Emmett must have imagined it would, decades before she'd ever set foot in Larkspur. They didn't give me a storage unit, she said quietly, turning the words over the way she had turned Odell's words over on that church bench so many months before. They gave me a locked door. And it turned out somebody had already left me the key. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. This has been a story about the quiet strength of patience and the idea that value is rarely found in what a family decides to hand you, but in what you choose to do with it once it's yours. If you found a piece of your own resolve in Nora's story, please Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of hidden treasures and unexpected triumphs. And let us know in the comments what forgotten box, crate, or unit you'd love to open and find something remarkable inside. We'll be back soon with the story of a lighthouse keeper's daughter, a locked lamp room, and a secret that had been waiting, quite literally, in plain sight.